Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where risk, insurance and geopolitics meet. I'm your host, David Benyon, and my guests today are Hoe-Yeong Loke, Head of Research at Airmic, and Alexander Frost, Chief Markets Officer at Airmic. Our topic is 100 Days of Trump 2.0, Tariffs in Focus. As we hit the first 100 days mark of US President Donald Trump's second term, no other single word sums up the preoccupation of business leaders around the world better than tariffs. This conversation will assess the impact of the US tariffs and how risk professionals and their organisations are responding to the fast-moving shifts in global trade. Airmic is the UK's Risk Management and Insurance Association, an industry non-profit organisation that represents its membership community of risk professionals. Hoe-Yeong Loke's background is in political risk consultancy and think tanks in the UK and Singapore, having started his career as an Associate Fellow at the European Union Centre at the National University of Singapore. He's been cited as a commentator in The Economist, BBC and Reuters, and has been invited as an expert witness to assist a constitutional commission in Singapore, among other institutions. Alexander Frost has enjoyed a 15-year career in risk and insurance. Before joining Airmic in 2020, Alex was a political risk analyst and then Head of Global Risk Intelligence and Data at AXCO Insurance Information Services in London. Alex is an associate in risk management with the institutes in the United States and holds a master's degree in East European, Russian and Eurasian studies from Carleton University, a bachelor's in history from Concordia University in Canada, and is an alumnus of the Faculty of Philology at St. Petersburg State University in Russia. I've known Airmic for many years and worked with Alex and Hoe-Yeong previously, so it's a great pleasure to bring you this lively conversation with two guests who share my passion for geopolitical risk, and whose roles mean that they are really key representatives of the risk management and insurance buying community. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Alex and Hoe-Yeong.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Good to be here.
Well, our topic is 100 days of Trump.
Is it only 100 days? It feels like a lot longer.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I love the notion of this because it's like a job appraisal thing, right? 100 days into a new role, you assess how someone's doing in the job. And it seems to me that Trump, well, if it seems like a lot longer, as you say, then it's like he's already broken every rule in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hyperbole is something that's become very regular in geopolitics in recent years, but I really do feel like he's turned a lot of things on its head in only 100 days. Trade, military relationships, social systems, it's exhausting in many ways.
But don't forget, of course, we've had that first assessment during the first term, 2017. So we have seen some of this before, but not quite in this fashion, have we?
I don't know about you. I feel like his first term was so tame by comparison to the first 100 days.
Well, I think he had moderates around him that restrained him, didn't he, to some extent? And this time he's like, I've learned that lesson. I'm not going to have anybody to stop me from doing exactly what I want to do. And now we're getting pure unrestrained Trump.
MAGA is very much in charge.
Exactly. Well, before we go any further, if you could both, Alex, we'll start with you, and then Hoe-Yeong, give a sense of your roles at Airmic and what Airmic does.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Airmic is the largest risk management association for both the UK and Ireland as of 2022. Ireland is now an area in which we are active, recognized as the Risk Management Association. And our job is to represent the views of risk managers in the insurance marketplace, as well as with government, the public sector, to provide learning and networking for them and to advocate for them with their partners and with regulatory bodies. My role at Airmic is I'm the Chief Markets Officer, and that means I'm responsible for our development of our revenue streams, the growth of our membership, the growth of our partnership. But I'm delighted to be on this podcast because, my first passion and what I did for many years before this was I was a geopolitical risk analyst. First, I worked in academia in Canada and did some work with the Canadian federal government, and then a company called AXCO Insurance Information Services, where I was head of political risk for 9 years.
And you're representing today. You've got a Canada badge. I can see it.
I'm representing today. I'm wearing my Canada badge. I'm from Montreal.
And I think you're voting next week.
I'm voting next week, yes. We'll talk about the Canadian election a little bit later on.
We will get to that too, yeah. Hoe-Yeong.
So I am head of research at Airmic, which means that I lead our thought leadership work. We do surveys to keep the pulse on our members, what they think, risk managers who are hits with risk of big organizations. I also do publications to share good practice amongst the community of risk managers and insurance professionals.
How does geopolitical risk and political risk, however you want to slice and dice it, fit into the work that you do?
It's one of those risks that ran quite lowly in our surveys 5 years ago, and it's obviously just shot up It's not just because of the 24-hour news cycle and social media-driven world that has focused our attention to geopolitics, but clearly people are seeing that all this ties up together in geopolitics. So they are realizing they need to follow this thing called geopolitics and what's it mean for supply chains and all the rest of it.
One of the most interesting things, and I think Hoe-Yeong is absolutely right, it was seen as sort of a rather low priority risk for many years. What I've noticed in being in especially the insurance industry and the risk profession over the last 10 years is people used to think about political and geopolitical risk as something interesting that happened in jurisdictions far away. So it happened in emerging markets, where there was a lot of government intervention in the economy, but it didn't happen in your home economy, or if it did, it was mostly around things like tax. But I think Brexit really shook people up on that. The first Trump administration really shook people up about that. And then the war in Ukraine really changed things. Exactly. They realized it's much closer to home than they think.
It's also one of those things that risk professionals thought it was what politicians do, governments do, or what their head of public affairs do. But then they have now realized it affects everything they do in their day job.
Yeah.
As a journalistic perspective on the same trend, I remember being a reinsurance editor 10 years ago, let's say, and I usually describe it as like a page 42 story. It would be something that was in the media pack and you would cover it maybe once or twice per year. You might write a feature on the terrorism insurance market at Lloyd's or political risk business. And it was never anywhere near the front page. And the wars that were fought back then, for all they were the forever wars and they were very damaging in hindsight, were wars of choice, and they were fought, in sort of dusty places, and this kind of fits with that emerging markets picture. And I just feel the world's changed dramatically. Okay, so let's talk about tariffs and trade wars. So Alex, you're going to give us a North American focus today. So let's start with what we know. So what's the latest you're seeing from DC in terms of North American trade policy, tariffs?
Happy to. And obviously, this is a issue that's quite close to me. I have a lot of friends who are still living in Canada and family who are still living in Canada. And for them, it's truly an existential issue in many ways. But I think I'd just start by saying that the issue of tariffs and trade war, for lack of a better word, between the US and Canada isn't new. I mean, we did have a tariff and trade dispute with the Trump in his first administration between 2017 and 2021, when he imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum exports to the United States. And because then we were in NAFTA, he did this by using something very tricky, Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act, which allowed the US government to impose tariffs on any country that was deemed to be a national security risk to the United States. And so, he declared that because steel and aluminum were used in the making of aircraft and tanks, that the fact that so much of this comes from a foreign country, Canada was a national security threat to the Americans. So despite the fact that we fought with them in World War I and World War II and Korea and Afghanistan, we were a national security threat. But the signing of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement in 2019 sort of put that to bed, but it's back with a vengeance. And in February, it was announced there would be a 25% blanket tariff on all Canadian exports to the United States, excluding energy, which has a 10% tariff. We were excluded from the new so-called reciprocal tariffs that were announced in April. We got off somehow on that one. But since we already have a 25% tariff, I think the Americans feel the view in Washington, D.C., or certainly from the White House, is that they can sit back and see what the impact is on the Canadian economy. But I also think they're waiting for the outcome of the Canadian election on the 28th of April before they make any further deals or announcements. They'd like to know who they're dealing with. And until recently, it was a pretty competitive election. So we can discuss that in a little bit more depth.
I think we were also going to talk about how both North and South, how Ottawa, but also how Mexico City is responding to this new Trump administration's tariffs and maybe taking different approaches.
Absolutely. So, we were both in NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was replaced by this US-Mexico-Canada agreement in 2019. And I think Mexico City and Ottawa have taken really different approaches to this. The Mexicans under Claudia Sheinbaum, who's been their president only since October of last year, so she's got time to play with. They have taken more of a conciliatory approach in looking at American demands. Just to have a quick word about what those demands are, the Americans obviously want illegal migration to stop at the Mexican-American border, and they're concerned about the amount of drugs, and particularly fentanyl, that's crossing the border into the United States. And so Mexico City has tried to show good faith in deploying 10,000 troops to the border and in cracking down on fentanyl production. And they too were excluded from the new reciprocal tariffs in April. And their government is saying that this is because they've played ball and they have done some things that the Americans want. And they really appreciate the fact that they've been excluded from this. Whereas Ottawa has taken a very hard line. We have imposed dollar for dollar reciprocal tariffs on American imports. And those tariffs have been targeted towards states that are heavily Republican. So we have tariffs on things like Florida orange juice, Kentucky bourbon, perfumes that are manufactured in the Midwest and in the Sun Belt, on sleeping bags and other camping equipment, for example, which I think also comes from Republican states. And we have launched an internal campaign to buy Canadian, to really try to reduce our reliance on American exports. So we're taking quite a bellicose line.
And the response is not just at federal level, is it? There's regional Ontario, for instance.
Yes, absolutely. In the Canadian government, foreign trade, a lot of it depends on provincial governments. They have a lot of power in their hands to regulate that. And that's particularly true of energy. And it's interesting, when people think of Canadian energy, they tend to think of Alberta and the oil patch. And obviously we are one of the major oil and gas exporter to the United States. But millions of homes, 1.5 million homes in the US Midwest and about 2 million homes in New York and New England are powered by hydroelectricity that comes from the James Bay hydroelectric plants in Ontario and in Quebec. And Doug Ford, the Conservative Premier of Ontario, said that he wouldn't be afraid to use energy as a retaliatory measure. And he imposed a 25% surcharge in February on exports to the US, which really made the Trump administration sit up, because a lot of those Midwest households voted for Republicans.
It's interesting, this notion of how to respond. Some countries and some regional governments taking a more conciliatory tone and others hitting back. And then that becomes escalatory, perhaps, and you end up with a trade war. But then again, if you roll over too much, I think certainly there's no consensus on what the best way to respond is. We're seeing that around the world.
We are indeed. And as you say, there is some disparity between what the federal government would like to do in Canada and what the provincial governments would like to do. So Alberta, which is a much more conservative province, an oil and gas province, they want to take a much softer line with the Americans. Eastern provinces want to take a much harder line. But what I would say about the overall Canadian position is it's hard to overestimate what a shock this has been to Canadians as well as to their respective federal and provincial governments. I mean, we do $960 billion in total trade with the United States every year. And it's hard to overestimate the integration between our two economies. 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States. It's our major tourist destination. We play in the same hockey and basketball and baseball leagues, And I think many Canadians who feel positively about America, myself included, I love Americans, they're great. We're very angry about it. There's a real wellspring of national patriotism and opposition to how the Americans have handled this. And I think that's going to play out and feed through into policy, because people are asking their governments at every level to take a very, very strong line with the Americans on this.
And of course, we have an election. Just to be clear, we're recording this episode on the 24th of April, and it's time to go out to coincide perfectly with the first 100 days of Trump's reign on the 30th of April. So the election is on the 28th. So it will have already happened. So with that caveat, to be quite careful about what we say, but what are your expectations?
We can draw some pretty broad conclusions from this election, and it is going to be an incredible election in Canada, because Justin Trudeau, who was our prime minister since 2015 and was until early January, I think in late December he announced his intention to resign. He was trailing by something like 25 points, the Liberal Party, which he represents, trailing by 25 points in the polls. It's always hard for an incumbent government after 9 years, and the Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre looked like they were going to walk it. It was going to be a cakewalk election. And Trudeau's resignation, he was very unpopular, and his replacement by Mark Carney, who of course is the former governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, take over that party. We have, I say we because I'm a Liberal Party voter, but we have recovered something like 25 points in just about 30 days. And at the moment, there is about a 70% chance, if you look at the polls and the aggregators in Canada, there's about a 70% chance that the Liberal Party will win a fourth consecutive mandate in power and a majority government to boot. And Trudeau, of course, his last administration was a minority. So stunning turnaround.
But it's going to be a much closer result than what it seemed like before.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It is going to be a closer result. But I still think, it looks very much like the Liberals will win this election with quite a strong mandate. And one of the reasons for that is that the opposition party, the Conservative Party of Canada under Pierre Poilievre, have adopted some of the populist language, attacks on woke ideology, attacks on elites, attacks on media, and attacks on high taxation and bureaucracy. And those are sort of ringing hollow when we're in the middle of a trade war with the United States led by Trump. So it's really wounded him, the trade war. And I think that Mark Carney, he's going to be quite an interesting, if he does remain prime minister, he's going to be quite an economically focused, domestically focused prime minister. And I think his three big priorities are likely to be looking for alternative trade routes and trade partners so that we are less reliant on the Americans. I think he is going to prioritize national industries, the development of import substitution industries for sectors like agriculture, and especially for our vital auto sector. We buy a lot of agricultural products, particularly fruit and vegetables, from the United States because they have a warmer climate. So throughout the year, they can grow vegetables we can't. But the auto sector is really the big success story of the NAFTA free trade agreement, that we have this integrated supply chain along with Mexico, where raw materials are brought from Canada down to Mexico. They're assembled in some fashion. They're sent up to the Midwest. Different parts and equipment are added. They're sent back to Canada for further processing. Then they're sent back to the United States. So the Trump administration's tariffs, especially the steel and aluminum tariffs that are part of this 25% blanket, are really difficult for that sector. And I think Mark Carney has announced there's going to be a $2 billion national stabilization fund for that, which will come as a great relief to the risk managers and the leaders of those companies because they're facing financial ruin. So that sector alone is one of vital interest to the Canadian economy. And I think Mark Carney and the Liberals are going to prioritize supporting that, as well as national industries like aerospace and aero defense. And there's going to be a big investment in defense because Canadian defense has relied on the Americans for so many years. I was looking at it last night in advance of this podcast. I think we only have 3 active battalions and a tank brigade ready to actually go anywhere in the world. And not only do we have the world's longest undefended border, over 8,000 kilometers, almost 9, that we have to now potentially think about beefing up with the Americans, but we also have to defend Canadian interests in the Arctic. The Arctic archipelago and the Arctic Ocean, is a huge area of priority, both from economic development as well as defense for Canada. So we need to be able to build bigger icebreakers, new deep water ports, and there will be a lot of funding from the Canadian government for that.
To be clear, that you can spin that both ways, because Canada's lack of defense spending is an excuse or a reason that Trump gives for taking a hard line.
And I find it difficult to say anything positive about the Trump administration at this moment in time, but I have to say that some of their criticisms on their allies, and Canada in particular, for not spending more on defense, for sort of leaning on the Americans, is absolutely true. That we have not ever met our NATO defense spending targets since the end of the Cold War, and we need to make big investments to step up in defense. Where that money comes from, I'm not sure.
For all my love of military history, this is not a military history podcast, but the defence sector is certainly a much bigger topic of conversation than it used to be. And if you did have shares in Rheinmetall a couple of months ago, you did rather well. And if you had shares in Northrop Grumman a month or two before that, you also did rather well, less so recently.
As an opportunity to put in a plug for Airmic, we have obviously members who are in the defense industry and people like BAE Systems and others. And I said to them, we really need to convene some discussions in the association about what the new US administration, what the implications are for defense in the UK.
Well, you've got massive multinational projects like, when it comes to building ships or fighter jets or whatever, and you've got countries that can come together to do that and decisions to be made.
And I think, Dave, that's a very important point you make, which is, the procurement and the production of those is so integrated between so many different countries. And for Canada, so much of our defense integration is with the United States. And if it's unreliable, then we need to develop those capabilities on our own.
Well, defense is, because it's such a sophisticated, complex industry, it's probably the ultimate example of complex supply chains. We'll get into that. Let's move the focus across the Pacific to China, which is definitely, in terms of how countries are responding to the Trump trade policies, China's on the receiving end of tariffs more than anybody else and fits that mold of responding in terms of it becoming an escalating trade war.
First, to give the context, the US has slapped on China tariffs of something between 145% to 245%. It may change again tomorrow, it may not change again tomorrow. What you have got there basically is a trade embargo between the world's 2 largest economies. And that's serious. And the retaliatory tariffs that China has slapped on the US is something like 125%.
The numbers are getting crazy at this point.
It is indeed getting crazy. Although it seems like the expectation is for de-escalation at this point, but let's see how it goes. Actually, the Chinese response has been very restrained. Their retaliatory tariffs on the US affects only something like 10% of US imports into China. They've launched investigations into companies, American companies in China, such as Google. But Google doesn't have a huge presence in China or huge operations in China. And one of the other companies that the Chinese are investigating is already under investigation. So it's not a dramatic response. And clearly, the reason is that the Chinese economy is struggling. The Chinese economy is export-led, so it's in interest not to exacerbate this trade war with the US. The Chinese leaders want to avoid further US tariffs for this reason. So that's not so much the point that there's this ever so escalating tariff levels on the two countries. But it is the fact that I think we're seeing the world breaking into trading blocks. The US sphere of influence, the Western sphere of influence and of economic activity, and the Chinese sphere of influence of economic activity. So this is really economic decoupling en bloc.
The Chinese economy is so reliant on exports. They are the poster child for Trump's view on trade surpluses, I think. And what he's trying to solve is that imbalance as he sees it.
All these Chinese goods will have to go somewhere. And that's why there are fears of dumping of these goods. Just yesterday, the UK government has talked about some restrictions to prevent such dumping activity from going on here in the UK. But again, the real losers of all this are the US multinationals. They are the biggest beneficiaries of this state of hyper-globalization of the past 30 years. And so it's going to hit them really hard as they try to reconfigure their supply chains.
Yeah, well, let's not forget, a lot of them have, I mean, even within the Trump administration, Elon Musk's Tesla has pretty big Chinese domestic manufacturing presence.
So he's hit pretty hard, which is also why he's talking about scaling down his involvement in the government department for cutting down expenditures. But this works both ways. The Chinese are also diversifying their supply chains. Just for instance, a huge bulk of order of soybeans from Brazil instead of the US. So there's lots of reconfiguration going on here in the global economy.
So we're seeing this shift towards deglobalization, the world splitting off into competing economic blocs.
It's no coincidence that the week after Trump unveiled his Liberation Day tariffs, Xi Jinping was making a big tour of Southeast Asia. He was in Vietnam, hit by, I think, 45%, 47% of tariffs by the US, and Malaysia, 25% tariffs of Malaysian goods into the US. Again, they've been quite restrained, the Chinese leaders, but they have also been very careful to warn their Southeast Asian trading partners not to retaliate too hard to drive up this trade war. But also, the Chinese are basically trying to get these countries into their orbit. And recall that Malaysia and Vietnam were considered the prime destinations for friendshoring by the US administration. Or the previous one.
Now, I was reading just the other day about the amount of goods that are traded with the US that say made in Vietnam, but really they're assembled in Vietnam, they're made in China. So this is a way around the tariff system to some extent.
It is a way around the tariff system. But also, the whole friendshoring idea didn't really take off. It's always going to be hard to relocate your manufacturing, your factories in different countries. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes years to shift your operations. But also, businesses that we have been talking to just didn't see very serious support from the Biden administration to help them with this friendshoring idea, which, by the way, it's dead. It's definitely dead in this day and age of the Trump tariffs, but it really died before Trump took office. So it actually died in the dying days of the Biden administration. Recall, for example, that it was the Biden administration which blocked Nippon Steel, this is the largest Japanese steel company, from acquiring US steel. And that was couched in the language of branding Japan as a national threat. And that was a shock to the Japanese and to America's trading partners in Asia. So it's something that we're seeing across the aisle in US politics too, both Democrats and Republicans. The example I can think of here is obviously a more hawkish policy towards China. This is one of the few things that Democrats and Republicans can agree on in this day and age of polarized politics. And perhaps this is one other issue that they can agree on too, that to be more self-sufficient as American industry.
If I could just make a point there, Hoe-Yeong, I think you're absolutely right about the end of friendshoring completely. Developments in the Trump administration are the clearest possible indication of that, because I think many of our Western liberal democracies, both in Europe and North America, Canada and the EU, would have thought of the United States as a friendly country. And it just goes to show how quickly things can change in the current geopolitical environment, that what was once a friendly, regulatorily aligned trading partner suddenly may not be. So the whole concept of friendshoring seems to be out, and the concept of import substitution seems to be in. And can you develop many of those industries nationally, if possible?
So we're going to look at perma-crisis management. So we already alluded to the fact that it's not one crisis. We're in a whole new era, I think, of geopolitics and insecurity. So where does this leave risk managers? How are chief risk officers within some of these multinationals responding to the current environment of continuous disruption?
So the big issue here is supply chain risk, obviously. And we as Airmic have done a big question survey. This is our weekly sort of pulse survey we do on our members every Monday morning. And 58% of respondents to this survey, which we did 2 weeks ago, were saying that US tariffs only have some impact on their operations. But the overwhelming concern is this whole uncertainty of frequent tariff changes one day after the next. And so it's about keeping up with what's going on. Data is what they're looking out for.
I agree, Hoe-Yeong, that supply chains and issues around trade and business continuity are the biggest issues. There's another issue that is probably keeping a lot of organizations up at night, and that is some of the legal and regulatory risks that are coming along with these geopolitical changes. Now, I was speaking to some of our partners and our members the other day, and one of the areas that they identified, and obviously I won't use any names, is that some of these big firms in the United States, multinationals, service providers, as well as manufacturers, have been sent directives by the US government asking them to disclose their DE&I practices. If you bear with me for a second, that they might be in violation of equalities legislation in the United States for following practices like affirmative action. Now, if you are a multinational that is based in both the EU and the United States, and you're an integrated organization, and in the EU, it's encouraged that you actually follow DE&I practices or that you report on DE&I practices, and in the United States, it's suddenly being discouraged. How do you, as an integrated organization, operate globally? You need to have a more compartmentalized approach to regulatory alignment. I mean, these are huge problems for the risk management community, and their legal departments and their risk departments are going to be asked to weigh in on this.
And it's going to be about keeping up to speed with all these regulatory changes and developments and the political dynamics behind that. And there's no shortage of information online these days, clearly. But the question is, how do risk managers keep on top of all these developments? They would love to have an AI tool that can analyze all these things.
And I think just, the starting point for a risk manager, for anybody involved, in the management of an organization, be that leadership, strategy, sustainability teams, if you'd agree, Hoe-Yeong, is always situational awareness. Having a robust system in place to keep you informed about what the changes are or are likely to be in those jurisdictions. You can't understand all the political and geopolitical intricacies of what is going on in Brussels and Washington, D.C. all by yourself. You need reliable partners to provide you that information, people who let you know the red flags when they are coming so that your risk plans can be properly aligned and flexible and change, and so that, for me, is always the first step.
And of course, it was not too long ago where businesses and organizations had to deal with this fast-changing environment of new rules every day, COVID pandemic, right? So we've been through this before, where one may not know the rules for lockdown the next day or the week after in order to make business plans for the next week or two, let alone the next quarter.
We've already said that friendshoring is effectively dead rather than just fading. Is there any data around that? Have you got some survey data on attitudes among risk management professionals to supply chain risk, for instance?
So yes, we have done surveys as to how our members are dealing with supply chain risk. The baseline mitigation approach, obviously, is diversification on those suppliers, but also more and more of our risk managers are talking about supplier segmentation, which is where you weight the relative importance of your suppliers, their risk exposures, and therefore not just to diversify, but to really delve deeper into how you spread your risk across all these suppliers.
Does that take into account this whole splitting off of regional blocks?
That will always be nice in theory, obviously, but it's difficult to pull off, especially if you're in a very fast-changing environment. But I think it's about horizon scanning, it's about planning for scenarios. Not too many scenarios, but planning for a few scenarios in case your suppliers in one continent are rendered unrealistic as suppliers.
And that seems the problem with this, because if you've got perma-crisis, so just one after another, it can feel like a fool's errand trying to draw up a list of relevant scenarios. You're not going to have quite the right scenario in your book of case studies to look up when the next crisis hits on Monday morning. We've already mentioned, I think, business continuity planning and business continuity management. So it may be helpful to have that kind of framework in place. But what's the emphasis then? Because if you don't want to be too doctrinal in terms of having a scenario for everything, what's the emphasis then on this?
I think the word for me that we use a lot at Airmic is flexibility and adaptability. As you say, you don't always have the right tool in your kit or the right scenario up your sleeve immediately. So it's about being proactive and prepared and ultimately being flexible, being able to change things when you need to. Because as we've seen, just to return to the Canadian example for a moment, when Canada was going to impose reciprocal tariffs on the United States that were going to impact all these different imports, the Canadian government announced they were going to delay the implementation for 2 weeks to give companies time to source alternative supply chains and alternative arrangements. And I thought to myself, God, 2 weeks, that's not enough time to do that. But a company and a risk management department that is flexible and is prepared to change suppliers and has the need to change suppliers without necessarily knowing exactly who it will be, but a scenario where they might need to suddenly change supply chains, that kind of proactivity is what you need in permacrisis.
So just a continuation of the point I think you're making, Alex, but the consequences for crisis management, it seems you need to be able to have the team in place to hit the ground running quite fast, even if you don't quite know what the crisis is going to be.
Absolutely. That's part of that flexibility and proactivity that I'm speaking about. Preparedness is knowing who is in the crisis management team, having run some tabletop scenarios so that people know what their roles and responsibilities are. And I think, and I've never been a member of a crisis management team, but we've discussed it at Airmic enough. But I think that one of the most important things, in terms of good practice is not to have a massive bloated team where everybody from a senior level is involved. But do you have a person in a leadership role, somebody who is there from legal, somebody who is there from PR, and definitely somebody who is there from risk, and that they all know exactly what their jobs are so they're not competing with each other to handle the crisis.
And having that smaller team obviously helps you for agility and flexibility. But obviously, being agile doesn't mean you improvise your response on the fly. There must be some preparedness behind that. Stress testing all your scenarios is obviously very important. And that's where the collaboration with, say, internal audit for that assurance piece is very important. 3 lines model, the second line, the third line. So the stress testing your plans for all these crises when it hits shouldn't be done when crisis hits, but before.
And continually updating the plan if you have one for crisis management. I think we've said many times at Airmix about risk registers and other important risk documents and plans that they're not something that you get out once a year and review, and blow the dust off. It's an organic document that needs to be worked on continually throughout the year.
Whoever is in that chief risk officer or risk manager seat is quite often the same person who buys insurance for the organization. I wonder, because in a geopolitical risk context, the kind of insurance products that on this podcast get talked about, things like political violence, political risk, clearly, terrorism covers, sometimes cyber, and just a lot of these specialty market products, they often emphasize that crisis management function. So you will, for example, cyber, you'll get consultants who would, I think, add to that crisis management team. So you'd potentially have, depending on what the crisis is, you will have, whether it's joining via a video link or whatever, but you'll have some external consultants who would be part of that, an extended team conversation, I imagine. I just think it's an interesting question because depending on what the crisis is, it might be a different insurance product that the service add-ons to it. But you could have in a situation where, like K&R is another example, where you get kind of crisis consultants who would advise on hostage negotiations. And even, we don't normally talk about it in this podcast, but even things like parametric products. Because when you've got a sudden spike in tariffs, that's the kind of thing where you could have a metric where a product would kick in and you have, for example, a crisis payout fast. So just trying to link this conversation to what goes on in insurance markets, because I feel like there are products that respond to this.
I think that is a very important point to make, which is that modern insurance is not just the simple financial risk transfer product that it once was. I think you were right to emphasize cyber. That's one of the ones that we often talk about, is that I think insurers and insurance brokers have worked very hard to either acquire or work hand in hand with those service providers so that they are able to offer you excellent service, say in cyber recovery. And you identified K&R in negotiation, in people risk safety. It's not really subject of this podcast, but it's something like flood recovery. It's not just the money, but you have people who come in to help you clear the water, air the space out, and get your business up and running again as quickly as possible. And those are what really add value to the corporations who need that immediate care.
That's all for now, although something tells me we'll be covering tariffs again as the Trump administration's policies continue to unfold. I hope you found that conversation as insightful as I did. One last thing, I'd be remiss not to mention that the Airmic Annual Conference 2025, a big event for risk management professionals in the UK, and naturally also for commercial insurance companies, takes place on the 9th to the 11th of June 2025 at the ACC Liverpool. I've been your host, David Benyon, and I'd like to thank my guests, Hoe-Yeong Loke and Alexander Frost of Airmic. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.